For 3 decades, Johnny Carson invited America into his living room every night. He made strangers laugh, made celebrities nervous, and turned ordinary conversations into unforgettable television. Millions of people believed they knew him. But the man who seemed completely comfortable under the spotlight was remarkably private when the cameras stopped rolling. And perhaps nobody understood that private side better than Alexis Maas. She was a woman Johnny Carson married after 3 failed marriages, the woman who remained beside him after he walked away from The Tonight Show, and the woman who was with him during the final chapter of his life. Yet after Carson died in January 2005, Alexis did something almost unimaginable for someone connected to one of the biggest television stars in American history. She disappeared. There was no best-selling memoir, no explosive television interview, no sensational tell-all revealing what Johnny Carson was supposedly like behind closed doors. Instead, Alexis protected her privacy almost as fiercely as Carson had protected his. And that silence has created a mystery that continues decades later. What did Alexis really know about the man America thought it knew? To understand why her silence matters, we have to go back to the beginning of Carson's final marriage. By the time Alexis Maas entered his life, Johnny Carson was already one of the most powerful entertainers in America. He had hosted The Tonight Show for years, survived the pressure of live television, and built a reputation as a king of late night. But his private life had been far less stable. Carson had already been married 3 times. His first marriage, to Joan Jody Wolcott, began in 1949. They had 3 sons together, Christopher, Richard, and Coy. Their marriage eventually ended in divorce in 1963. Later that same year, Carson married Joanne Copeland. That relationship lasted until 1972. Then came Joanna Holland, whom he married in 1972. Their marriage eventually became another painful chapter and ended in a highly publicized divorce in the 1980s. By the time Carson met Alexis, the comedian had already experienced enough heartbreak to make another marriage seem risky. But Alexis was different. She wasn't a television personality trying to build her own career. She wasn't someone looking for the spotlight. And unlike Carson, she had no reason to need the attention that came with his name. According to contemporary reports, Carson met Alexis Maas near his Malibu home. She had worked for a stock brokerage firm, and their relationship developed away from the television studio. In 1986, reports began appearing that Carson was considering marriage again. For a man whose previous marriages had generated plenty of headlines, Carson wanted this one handled differently. And on June 20th, 1987, Johnny Carson and Alexis Maas were married at his Malibu home in a remarkably private ceremony. The Los Angeles Times reported that the wedding was quiet and that the couple soon left for England, where they attended Wimbledon. There was no massive Hollywood wedding, no parade of celebrities, no television cameras waiting outside. Carson wanted privacy, and Alexis appeared to want the same thing. That detail would become extremely important later, because while Johnny was still appearing on television, Alexis remained largely outside his public persona. She didn't try to become a celebrity simply because she had married one. Instead, she became the person who occupied the space Carson valued most, the part of his life that wasn't being performed for an audience. Friends and colleagues noticed a difference. Producer George Slatter later described Alexis as a real love of Carson's life. People reported that Carson loved his show and loved jokes, but that Alex occupied a different place in his heart. That doesn't erase the complicated history of Carson's earlier marriages. It doesn't mean the final marriage was perfect. And it doesn't mean that everything reported about Carson's private life was true. But it does suggest that Alexis represented something Carson had been searching for years. A quieter life. By 1992, Carson was ready to leave The Tonight Show. For 30 years, the program had defined him. Night after night, he had walked onto the stage and become Johnny Carson, the confident host who seemed capable of handling anything. But retirement changed everything. On May 22nd, 1992, Carson hosted his final Tonight Show. The farewell was emotional. His surviving sons, Christopher and Coy, appeared during the final broadcast, and a photograph taken by his late son Richard was shown as part of the closing tribute. Richard, known as Ricky, had died in a 1991 car accident at the age of 39. That loss had devastated Carson. It was one of the rare times when the man famous for controlling his emotions in front of millions appeared genuinely vulnerable. When Carson returned to television after his son's death, he spoke about Ricky and showed his photography. He struggled with emotion as he talked about him. For viewers, it was a reminder that the person behind the jokes was carrying pain that television could never fully hide. Alexis was there during this period. She was also there when Carson's public life began shrinking. After retirement, Carson didn't become the kind of former celebrity who constantly appeared at Hollywood parties or accepted every interview request. He did the opposite. He became increasingly private. The man who had spent his career asking other people questions didn't seem interested in answering questions about himself. The transformation was remarkable. For decades, millions had watched Johnny Carson talk. After retirement, Carson mostly stopped talking publicly. He played tennis. He traveled. He spent time at home. He occasionally communicated with friends and people in the entertainment world. But the regular presence disappeared, and Alexis seemed to support that decision. In 1994, Carson made a rare appearance on David Letterman's program. He walked onto the stage and received a huge standing ovation. For a brief moment, the old Johnny Carson was back. But he didn't stay. He didn't launch a new program. He didn't attempt to reclaim the spotlight. He left. That appearance became one of his last television appearances. Then his health began to deteriorate. Carson had been a heavy smoker for decades. In 1999, he suffered a severe heart attack and underwent quadruple bypass surgery. In 2002, he revealed that he had emphysema. Even then, he kept much of his medical life private. Alexis remained beside him. And when Carson died on January 23, 2005, at the age of 79, the public learned that his final years had been spent largely away from the spotlight. CBS reported at the time that Carson had died peacefully and that his family described the loss as immeasurable. His body was cremated, and his ashes were given to Alexis. Then came the silence, and this is where the popular story about Johnny Carson's widow often becomes exaggerated. There was no dramatic confession in which Alexis suddenly revealed everything. There was no verified interview in which he exposed secret behavior or described some hidden side of Carson in sensational detail. Instead, she largely remained private. That is actually more consistent with what we know about both of them. Carson had spent his entire career creating a boundary between Johnny the entertainer and Johnny the private man. Alexis respected that boundary. The filmmaker Peter Jones, who directed the PBS American Masters documentary Johnny Carson, King of Late Night, later explained that he spent time with Alexis while making the film. His comments are particularly revealing. Jones said that Alexis and Johnny had remained close even though their later lives were quite private. He also explained that Alexis did participate in the documentary process, giving him access to a side of Carson that the public rarely saw. That is perhaps the closest thing to Alexis breaking her silence. Not a scandalous confession, not an attack, not a list of secrets. Instead, a quiet willingness to help preserve the story of the man she loved. And that distinction matters, because the public often assumes that silence means someone is hiding something. Sometimes it simply means someone doesn't believe everything needs to be shared. Alexis could have written a book. She could have sold intimate stories about Johnny's marriages, friendships, arguments, fears, and final years. She could have turned her position as a widow of one of television's most famous men into a public career. She didn't, and that decision makes her unusual in Hollywood history. Think about what Johnny Carson represented. He had spent 30 years listening to celebrities tell stories about themselves. He knew exactly how valuable personal information could be. He knew that audiences wanted secrets. He knew that controversy sold newspapers. He knew that his own private life was valuable. Yet after his death, Alexis apparently chose not to exploit that value. Perhaps she understood something the public didn't. Johnny Carson's real story was not simply a collection of scandals. It was a complicated human life. There were marriages that failed. There were professional battles. There were friendships that ended. There were moments when Carson's temper reportedly caused problems. There were periods when alcohol complicated his personal relationships. There was a devastating death of his son Ricky. There were health problems that eventually ended his life. But there was also extraordinary professional discipline. There was generosity toward young comedians. There were decades of making people laugh. There were friendships that lasted. And, according to people who knew them, there was a quiet relationship between Johnny and Alexis that existed largely outside the public's view. That may be why the final marriage is so difficult to understand from the outside. We simply don't have enough information. And Alexis has never seemed interested in filling every blank. One of the most revealing comments about their relationship came not from Alexis herself, but from people who knew Carson. George Slater described Alexis as the real love of Carson's life. That is significant because Carson had been married 4 times. The first 3 marriages became part of the public narrative. The 4th became something different. It was quieter. There were fewer headlines. There was no constant parade of public arguments. And after Carson retired, the couple could finally live without millions of people watching. Perhaps retirement was the first time Johnny Carson was truly able to separate himself from his television identity. He no longer needed to be funny every night. He no longer needed to interview guests. He no longer needed to deliver a monologue. He could simply be Johnny, and Alexis could simply be Alexis. When Carson died, she became something else in the eyes of the public. She became his widow, but she never seemed to embrace the role of celebrity widow. That is why the phrase finally breaks her silence can be misleading. The more accurate story is almost the opposite. She never really broke her silence. She occasionally allowed glimpses into their life, especially through the 2012 documentary, but she maintained the same privacy that had characterized their relationship. And perhaps that is the most interesting revelation of all. The woman who knew Johnny Carson during his final 18 years did not turn his private life into entertainment. She protected it. For a man who had spent his entire career entertaining millions, there is something strangely fitting about that ending. Johnny Carson gave America almost everything it wanted from him. He gave audiences jokes. He gave them interviews. He gave them characters. He gave comedians their big breaks. He gave late-night television a format that would influence generations of hosts who came after him. But he did not give the public everything. There was always a locked door. Alexis understood that door. And after his death, she didn't kick it open. She kept it closed. That doesn't mean there weren't painful memories behind it. There almost certainly were. A man cannot live for 7 to 9 years without accumulating regrets, heartbreaks, mistakes, and complicated relationships. But not every memory belongs to the public. And perhaps that is a lesson behind Alexis Maas' story. Sometimes the most revealing thing a person can do is refuse to reveal everything. Johnny Carson's legacy belongs to television history. His private life belongs, at least in large part, to the people who lived it. Alexis Maas chose to respect that boundary. And more than 20 years after Carson's death, that decision may be exactly why people remain fascinated by her. Everyone wants to know what Johnny Carson was really like. Everyone wants a final secret. Everyone wants a story behind the smile. But perhaps there was never going to be one final confession. Perhaps there was only a woman who loved a complicated man, lived beside him through the quietest years of his life, and then decided that some memories were more valuable when they remained private. Johnny Carson spent his career telling America that the show would continue tomorrow night. Eventually, the show ended. The lights went out. The audience went home, and the man behind the desk disappeared from public life. Alexis Maas was there for that final chapter. She saw the man after the applause. She knew the person who existed after the camera stopped, and when he was gone, she didn't replace his silence with her own performance. She simply remained quiet. Maybe that's why the mystery surrounding Johnny Carson's widow has lasted so long. The public was used to Johnny Carson talking. It was never prepared for the woman closest to him to say almost nothing. And sometimes, in Hollywood, silence isn't the absence of a story. It is the story